Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for taking time to join us. This morning, I'd like to take a few moments to talk to you about one of Jesus' most famous parables, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. Now, what we're going to do first is we're going to lay some general groundwork for this parable here in the studio, and then we're going to head over into the classroom to further explore this fascinating and soul-searching parable. So I invite you to go ahead and open up your Bible and get ready at Luke chapter 18, verse number 9, and let's open up our hearts to receive the words of Jesus. So let's start today by talking about the placement and the overall purpose of our parable. Now, you may have noticed that this parable is unique to the Gospel of Luke. It's not found in any of our other New Testament Gospels, so it's uniquely Lucan, we would say. Now, it actually serves as a conclusion to what's referred to as Luke's special or Luke's central section. And it's a section of the Gospel of Luke that started all the way back in Luke chapter 9, verse 51. Luke tells us that Jesus set his face to go to Jerusalem. And then we find this long journey going to Jerusalem. And he's going to encounter a lot of different people along this journey. There are going to be a number of different responses to his message along this journey. And so when we arrive at our parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector, we really come to a conclusion. And this conclusion really reminds us of how important it is for us to have a right attitude towards God and a right attitude towards others. And I think you'll agree that even among the most religious, it is very difficult sometimes to maintain a right attitude. Sometimes it's a struggle throughout the day to try and maintain a right attitude before God as we serve Him and as we do right things. And then it's also hard sometimes for us to have a right attitude and to keep a right attitude towards our brother and towards our fellow man. So when we talk about the overall purpose of our parable this morning, it really does remind us and has a lot to teach us about our attitude. So let's start by talking about the two actors or the two main characters that we find in our parable. Now, we know a parable is an illustrated story. We find that Jesus is a master parable teacher, isn't he? If you've read Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you know that Jesus is communicating his message via the form of a parable almost on every other page. They're very common. It was a great way for Jesus to engage his audience and really connect with them. And so we've got two main characters in our particular parable that we're talking about this morning. We've got a Pharisee and we've got a tax collector. And you want to talk about extreme opposites, that's what we've got here in our story. There was a world of difference between a Pharisee and a tax collector. And so we have to ask the question, how would Jesus' original audience have understood these two characters? Would they have been rooting for one over against another? How would they have expected the Pharisee to behave? How would they have expected the tax collector to behave? So this morning, let's start by talking about the Pharisees. Now, the Pharisees today, by and large, in Christian circles, especially in the West, we tend to have a negative view towards the Pharisee. It's almost like the term Pharisee is a bad word in some Christian circles. I think you'd probably agree that if someone called you a Pharisee, they weren't paying you a compliment, okay? So Pharisee for us today can almost be a bad word. We have a negative starting point. And that's very unfortunate because that simply wasn't the case with Jesus' original audience. We know that the Pharisees were widely popular with the people. The Pharisaic movement as a whole started really on a good foot. Back in the centuries that led up to the earthly ministry of Jesus, we call it the Hellenistic period, we find that there was widespread immorality and unfaithfulness, and there were a group of people who stood up and separated themselves and were determined to live a holy, a righteous, and a godly life, a separated life. And this is the origins of the Pharisaic movement. Most would hold that the term Pharisee actually means a separated one. And so this is a group of people that originally separated from the ungodly and were determined to live a pure and a holy and a righteous life. Now, unfortunately, what happens with probably all religious groups is as time goes by, hypocrisy can set in. So this is not something that's unique to Judaism, or in our case, the Pharisaic movement here. This is something that could be said of all religious groups. So hypocrites within any movement can do a lot of damage. And so we find what happens in the pages of our New Testament is Jesus is actually engaged on a number of different occasions with the Pharisees. And what we have to keep in mind is most of the Pharisees came from just the general population. They weren't descendants of the priesthood, so they weren't of priestly lineage. They weren't serving God there in a priestly capacity in the Jerusalem temple. These were the general people that you would run into on a day-to-day basis in your town, in your synagogue. In fact, the synagogue was the domain or under the oversight of the Pharisees by and large. So the New Testament records that Jesus is oftentimes going into the synagogue and he's teaching. So it shouldn't shock us that he's going to have a lot of interaction with members of the Pharisaic party. And unfortunately, sometimes it's been purported that Jesus was anti-Pharisee, or he didn't have anything in common with the Pharisees, or he criticized everything about this movement. And that's just simply not the case. In fact, Jesus had a lot of points of contact with the Pharisees as far as viewpoints, as far as doctrine, as far as teaching. These groups had much in common. And when we find most of the accounts where Jesus is in dialogue with the Pharisees, he's having to deal with things like hypocrisy or religious pride, or Pharisees who were trying to put their traditions ahead of the revealed Word of God, or certain members of the Pharisaic party that were trying to push their traditions and enforce them on others. And so Jesus is having to deal with these issues and speak very clearly. It's not that he's against the Pharisaic party as a whole. He's trying to just point them back to their origins because he realizes how important and how significant of a role the Pharisees played in Jewish society. Josephus tells us, the first century historian Josephus, you've probably heard of him, has a lot to tell us about how popular the Pharisees were among the Jewish populace. They had in fact become the teachers of the people. Where at one time in Jewish history, the Levites or the priesthood were looked to provide teaching to the people. But by the first century, people were looking to the Pharisees. So Jesus realizes how important this group is, and he wants to make sure that their teaching and their behavior is in line. And again, this is something we all have to keep an eye on. As believers, we have to make sure, right, that our teaching and our behavior are in sync. We don't want to be guilty of hypocrisy either. So I want to give you a quote from Robert Stein, who I think really has a brilliant point to make regarding the Pharisees. And he notes this: "The kind of commitment that leads to the finest piety is also frequently accompanied by hypocrisy. Neither Pharisaism nor Christianity is exempt from this unfortunate tendency." Now, when it comes to the tax collectors, they were generally despised. They were known for their corruption, for their greed, and for their general disinterest in ungodliness in general. We know from historical sources that many of the Jewish people viewed tax collectors as traitors since they worked for Rome or the Herod family. Now, when it comes to the pages of our New Testament Gospels, we find that Jesus is in pretty regular dialogue and he interacts quite a lot with tax collectors. In fact, he chooses Matthew, a tax collector, to be one of his closest followers. And according to church tradition, it's this Matthew that's responsible for our New Testament Gospel of Matthew. Now we know that Jesus is going to face some criticism for hanging out and reaching out and associating with tax collectors and sinners. And oftentimes tax collectors are grouped in with sinners in general. So they're basically synonymous terms, we would say, when it comes to our New Testament Gospels. Now, interestingly enough, if we look to Luke chapter 19, the chapter that comes right after our parable here, of the parable of the tax collector and the Pharisee, we find that Jesus is about to arrive in Jerusalem, and he makes a final stop, we would say, at Jericho. And remember, there's a great crowd that comes out to see Jesus as he's coming into town and as he's passing through town. And there is a man there, a chief tax collector by the name of Zacchaeus. Now, he's not the tallest guy in town, right? And so what does he have to do? He has to climb up in a fig tree to get a bird's eye view of Jesus. And Jesus sees him, right? And says, "Hey, Zacchaeus, you need to come down out of that tree because I'm coming to your house." And then a rumble begins to work through the crowd. And some of the Pharisees that were there and the religious of that crowd said, "What is he doing going to the house of Zacchaeus, a chief tax collector?" And so Jesus is criticized right to the end, isn't he? And so Jesus goes in and has this great dinner. And at some point during the dinner, Zacchaeus stands up and has a great declaration to make. And he says, "Today, I'm making a declaration that if I've treated anyone unfairly, if I've cheated anyone out of anything, I'm going to pay it back and I'm going to make restitution, full restitution." And Jesus responds by saying, "Today salvation has come to this house. For this man too is a son of Abraham," or a child of Abraham. And then I love Luke chapter 19, it's verse number 10. Jesus says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost." So what an incredible and encouraging passage this is. This man, Zacchaeus, a chief tax collector whose life is completely and totally transformed by the power of Jesus and his message. Now, as we get ready to go into the classroom, let's just remember our starting point. Jesus' original audience would have had a favorable attitude towards the Pharisee and a negative attitude towards the tax collector. They would have been expecting the Pharisee to do the right thing, to set the right example. And they wouldn't have had high hopes for the tax collector. So now let's head over into the classroom and let's really examine this incredible and this inspiring parable. Now let's go ahead and read Luke chapter 18. It's verses 9 through 14. It says, "He also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and they despised others. 2 men went up to the temple to pray, one a Pharisee, the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and prayed thus with himself, or about himself, 'God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get.' But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but beat his breast, saying, 'God, be merciful to me, a sinner.' I tell you the truth, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other." That's our shock factor. There it is. That it's the tax collector and not the Pharisee that goes home justified. If these two weren't opposites, then what would be the purpose of our parable? Think about it for a minute. There'd be no purpose. Okay? So we've got total opposites, and the one that we don't expect to go home justified does in fact go home justified, while the religious person in our story, guess what? They've just wasted a lot of time. How many of you know if we're not careful, we can go through the religious rigmarole of life and we can be spinning our wheels if this heart's wrong. God didn't call us here to just be religious. Hello? No. We've got to do, as we say so many times, the right things for the right reasons. Now, we've got to identify our target audience, okay? The target audience, well, look at verse number 9. Who's the message of the parable aimed at? Who does he tell it to? to some, not all, but to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous, or maybe your translation reads, they were sure that they themselves were righteous. But it didn't end there, did it? They also looked down on everyone else. Have you met self-righteous people like this in the church before? The holier than thou. Yes. And they have a very lofty opinion of themselves. And they look at you, you little peasant, you. Yes. We've all met people like this, okay? Thankfully, not everyone is like this. But in every congregation all around the globe, I bet you'll find at least one of these people. They're there, okay? And so the Pharisee in our parable here, he's really an extreme caricature of such type of religious people. Now, I do want to point out that the Pharisees themselves, righteous Pharisees, were very quick to acknowledge that there was a trend of hypocrisy that was spreading through their movement. They were very concerned about it. Much like I think you all are concerned that there is an element of hypocrisy in local congregations and within Christianity today, right? This should bother you when we see hypocrisy. Remember, what's a hypocrite? It's the Greek word for an actor, right? One who puts on a show. One who appears to be one thing, but in fact is something very different. So while Jesus never condemned the Pharisaic movement as a whole, he, like the Pharisees themselves, rebuked hypocrisy within that movement. Okay, so we have to always remember that. When we come across these passages where Jesus is in dialogue with Pharisees and he's calling them out on something, hey, let's make sure we realize that Jesus was trying to draw them back to the heart of what the Pharisaic movement was all about and how it all started out. Okay? So we've got to have that right starting point. Now, we really want to look at the setting of our parable itself. Okay? In our story, what happens? We've got two characters, the Pharisee and the tax collector, and they go to the temple there in Jerusalem. And why do they go there? They go there to pray. Right? They go there to pray. Now, we know that private prayer in the temple could be offered at any time. You could go into the Jerusalem temple and you could pray in private pretty much any time you wanted to. But oftentimes, you would do so in conjunction with the various sacrifices that were done there in the temple. There were three main times of sacrifice in the Jerusalem temple: 9 a.m., noon, and 3 p.m. And oftentimes, people would go and they would pray 3 times a day. Very righteous people, if they lived in Jerusalem and were able, they would go 3 times a day and they would pray in conjunction with the sacrifices there in the temple. Now, while all religious Jews were expected to pray daily, the Pharisees were known for their emphasis in prayer. If you read the literature of the Pharisees, they always talk about how important prayer is. And so it shouldn't shock us that the Pharisee is going up to pray. What should shock us is that the tax collector is going up to pray. That's the real shock, okay? Because in contrast, tax collectors, man, they weren't known for prayer. They weren't known for their godliness, okay? So let's go ahead and look at the character, or rather the behavior of our two characters here. Now we'll start with the Pharisee, okay? Let's look at his attitude, and it's a bad one, okay? And let's look at the prayer that he prays. Now you may have noticed that the prayer of the Pharisee, it's more like a self-eulogy, isn't it? This guy feels really good about himself. Okay? He really has got a positive view of himself. Okay? Look at verse number 11. It says, he prayed this about himself. Or maybe your translation reads, he prayed this to himself. And Robert Stein points out that in itself, the prayer could be quite acceptable if. Everybody say if. Yeah. If the Pharisee were thanking God for protecting him from the circumstances that might have led him to become a thief or an adulterer. Can we all agree that if the guy had said, Lord, thank you so much for giving me the grace and the strength to resist a life of thievery? How many of you know that would be a good prayer to pray? Thank you for keeping me faithful to my wife and my family. How many of you know that would be a good thing to pray and thank God for? But the problem here is this guy is acting like he's done it in and of himself.
Ah, there lies the problem. He goes on to say, however, the Pharisee saw his not having succumbed to such sins as purely his own doing. Notice, there were no thanks for what God had done, but rather this long list of personal achievements. Did you notice all the I's as we were reading this? I. Have you ever met these kind of people? Feel like they are God's gift to the body of Christ? So thankful to have me in your church. Yep, that's the kind of attitude this guy has. Now in verse number 11 and 12, let's talk about it. Look at his religious devotion here. Look at his religious devotion. He declares to God that he had faithfully observed all the cardinal virtues of Judaism. There were 3 of them: prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. I don't know if you want to write that down or not, but prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Prayer, fasting, and almsgiving. Or tithing, we would say. Let's not forget that when Jesus gives his first public discourse, Michelle referenced it earlier. We talked about the parable that comes at the end of that Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Jesus starts off that Sermon on the Mount talking to his disciples. Remember, that's who that sermon is directed at, the disciples, while there's a crowd listening. And what does Jesus talk to them about there? Prayer, fasting, and giving. The top 3 within Judaism of Jesus' day. This is how Jesus starts his Sermon on the Mount off. Because sometimes, you know it's true, people have a way, religious people have a way of corrupting even good practice. Is it good to tithe? Yep. Is it a good thing to pray? Yep. Is it good to fast? Yep. But can we have the wrong attitude even in those very righteous things? You bet. And we see this is the problem with this guy. So you'll recall, you'll see here that Jewish people knew that these things were expected. Okay, but Jesus, again, he knows that error can creep in even in the most virtuous of religious practices. Now let's look at what happens here in verse number 11. Here's where it breaks down. He says, I am not like other men. Now, little quiz. Do you remember what the word Pharisee means? A separated one. Okay, a separated one. Let's say it together. A separated one. So he says, I'm not like other men. Now it's true that God's people should be different from unbelievers, right? We should be different. Being separate is a good thing. Okay, it's a good thing. But the Pharisee of our parable was using other people as his what? As his standard of measuring righteousness. And I think you'll agree that's a common pitfall among religious people, even today. We can tend to look around at other people, and we'll always be able to find somebody that's maybe not doing quite as good as we are. Hello? It's very easy to do that. And we can start feeling pretty good about ourselves. Oh yeah. But we've got to never allow the separateness of our life to lead to this kind of condescending attitude towards other people. Okay? We don't ever want to have this kind of self-righteous attitude. So look at verse number 12. What does he say? I feast twice a week. What? Oh, did I say something wrong? Oh, he said I fast twice a week. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands. How many of you fast twice a week? Now, I feel like I could get a lot of hands if I said, how many of you feast twice a week? Might be right up there with you. I'm in. Yeah. No, I fast twice a week. Now, understand this guy's going above and beyond what was required in the written law. Under Jewish law, one day of the year was a fast day, Yom Kippur. We've talked about it before. Yom Kippur. But even though only one fast a year was required, the Pharisees were known to fast 2 times a week. They fasted on Mondays and on Thursdays. On Mondays and on Thursdays. So they're going above and beyond even what God's written word said they had to do. They were going the extra mile. Now, in and of itself, is there anything wrong with that? Anything wrong if any of you out there or myself said, hey, I'm going to fast twice a week. I could probably handle doing that for a lot of different reasons, okay? But to fast twice a week, anything wrong with that? No. But if I start looking down on you because you don't fast twice a week, therein comes the problem.
Amen.
And sometimes our religious traditions, as good as they can be, nothing wrong. Man, what a righteous thing. Fasting 2 times a week. Praise the Lord. But when you start to, or I would start to look down on other people and say, well, they're not as spiritual as I do because they don't fast twice a week.
Right.
Or if I run around all the time saying, I fasted twice this week. Who am I like? I'm like that one Pharisee, right? Wearing up my good deeds and righteous actions up on my shoulder. Guess what I did? This is a problem. And then he even goes beyond, a step even beyond that. He says, I give 1/10 of all I get. Everybody say get. Yeah. I give 1/10 or a tithe of all that I get. Now, according to the written law, you tithe on everything that you earned, your wages. But notice this guy, he's tithing even on other things that weren't technically a wage, that technically he did not have to tithe on. But he said, I'm not only going to tithe on my wage, but if somebody blesses me and says, hey, I feel like giving you $100, guess what that dude's doing? I'm going to give $10 and pay it as a tithe. He went over and above. Now, is that a pretty cool thing to do? Is that awesome? Is that great? Yes. Yes. But we've got an attitude problem here, don't we? He even tithes of everything that comes into his possession, right? Even the tiny herbs from his garden, he adds. Now, this is very similar with a passage earlier that we see in Luke. I'll give it to you. It's Luke chapter 11. It's verse number 42. Luke 11:42. Listen to what Jesus said back then. He said, but woe to you Pharisees, for you tithe mint and rue and herbs of all kinds, and that's fine, but you neglect justice and the love of God. It is these you ought to have practiced without neglecting the others. So you see what Jesus says? No problem with you doing those things, but hey, don't forget about what? Justice and the love of God. And sometimes as religious people, as much as we don't like to admit it, we can strain out gnats and swallow camels. We can be chief petty officers, can't we? Man, this is uncomfortable. We act like this, okay? We can really emphasize all these other peripheral things that are good and acceptable, and we can let some huge things go. This is what Jesus is trying to call them back to. Hey, have both. It's not a this or that. Have both. We've got to have balance in our life, don't we? We really, really do. So this guy says, hey, I give 1/10 of all that I get. Now, Craig Evans has a brilliant note here, and I want to share it with you. He notes, the error of this Pharisee lies not in the fact that he's refrained from certain sins and has performed certain religious duties very faithfully. His sin lies in his lofty self-esteem. Because he's remained legally and ritually pure, and because he's fasted regularly and has tithed faithfully, he assumes that he's acceptable before God. He believes that he has arrived and there's no room for spiritual growth. Friends, none of us have arrived. And in this life, we are never going to arrive. There's always going to be room for improvement. Hello? So this Pharisee lost the sense of his own sinfulness, right? He forgot about his own sinfulness, about his own unworthiness before God. Now, what have we got? We've got a guy that can only recognize the sinfulness and unworthiness of others. Remember Jesus' earlier parable? Hey, before you try and start pulling that little speck out of your brother's eye, what do we got to do first? Look in the mirror, friend. There's a big old beam there. Let's make sure we're focused. Let's make sure we can really see to help our brothers and sisters. So as a result, he lost the wonder of God's grace, really. That's what happens in our story here. Now, Craig Evans goes on to add that salvation by grace means that one can never feel religiously superior to another. Let me say that again. Again, it's Craig Evans. Salvation by grace. Anybody here say by grace? Right? Salvation by grace means that no one can ever feel religiously superior to another. We've got to always be on guard by that, okay? And now, let's look at verse number 13. Look at the prayer and the attitude of the tax collector. This is where the shock comes in. We're already shocked because a Pharisee would pray like this. We're shocked. We can't believe it. And now we come to the tax collector, and we're expecting, probably if we're in Jesus' original audience, hey, if the Pharisee of the story missed it this bad, what on earth? How bad is it going to be for the tax collector? Hello? But instead, we're going to get a big shock because what? The tax collector had the right attitude before God and went home justified? Yep, let's look at it. As we read, the tax collector's attitude and his actions are very different with the parable's Pharisee here, okay? I love this. Robert Stein points out that the tax collector demonstrated his humble attitude even by his physical stance. What did he do? He stood where? Not close, but at a distance. At a distance. And he wouldn't even look up to God's dwelling place, the heavens. And what did he do? Verse number 13, he beat his breast. What does he do? He exhibits true humility, both in his attitude and in his actions. We're not expecting this if we're a member of Jesus' original audience. We're not prepared for this. So unlike the Pharisee in our parable, the tax collector offers God no list of virtues. There's no virtues, right? And he doesn't give a list of excuses either, does he, for his sinfulness? Well, you know, Lord, I'm this way because of this, that, and the other. No excuses. No boasting. I mean, he's just, hey, this is how it is. This is how it is. He realizes that he's done nothing to impress God, much less his fellow man, right? He simply acknowledges his own sinfulness. And what does he do? He makes an earnest appeal to God's mercy. Friends, it doesn't matter how religious we are, we have to always appeal to the mercy of God. None of us have earned the right to boast before God or before other people. We still need the mercy of God today as much as that very first day that we called on Him, right? We can never lose sight of how we need the mercy of God. Now I want to talk about His appeal here real quick tonight as we work towards a close. Look if you would. He says, have mercy on me, a sinner. How many of you have a sinner in your English translation? Just give me a wave. Does anyone have in your translation, have mercy on me, the? In your translation, the sinner. The sinner. All right. Unfortunately, English translations don't oftentimes put the word the in front of sinner. But there's a definite article in the Greek text. And here's why it's so important. The guy doesn't say, hey, have mercy on me, I'm just one of many sinners. Have mercy on me, a sinner. This guy, look what he says. The definite article's there. Have mercy on me, the sinner. Like Paul would later go on to say, I am the chiefest of the sinners. And so this guy, he's not thinking about the beauty. He's not thinking about anybody else, is he? He can only be focused on the fact that he has hurt the heart of God. He is the sinner, not just a sinner. He is the sinner. It's very strong how it comes across in our Greek text. And then, what's the finale here? What's our big shock factor? It's verse 14. I tell you, this man, the tax collector, went down to his home justified rather than the other. For all who exalt themselves will be what? Humbled. But all who humble themselves will be what? Will be exalted. Now we've got to talk about that term justified. We've heard it before. If we've been around church long enough, we've heard this term to be justified, or we've talked about justification. What exactly is it? The tax collector, not the Pharisee in our parable, went home justified. Now this term justified, it denotes far more than just merely being forgiven. It's not that this man just went home forgiven. He did, no doubt about it. But it means far more than that. It emphasizes a new standing. A new standing. Might want to write it down or log it in the brain. It emphasizes a new standing, a right standing before God. A right standing before God. So when we say we've been justified, it means we've been brought into a right standing before God. And the only way that happens is by God's grace and by His mercy. We can never earn a right standing. It doesn't matter how faithfully we tithe. It doesn't matter how faithful our church attendance is. It doesn't matter how religious we can be. That can never bring us justification. It's always and forever will be by the grace and the mercy of God that we have right standing with Him. We can never forget that. We've got to all, regardless of how long we've been walking with the Lord, every day as we come before Him, as we walk with Him, make our appeals to the mercy of God. That gets His attention. So the tax collector went back down from the temple justified. He's acquitted by God and not this uber religious Pharisee in our story. Okay, so the Pharisee remains religious, but that doesn't mean he's in right standing with God. Now that's where we've got to look inside, isn't it? We don't want to just be religious but not be in right standing with God. We want to be both. We want to be religious, because that religion's not a bad word either, by the way. Okay? As long as our heart's right and our motives are right. So we want to be religious. We want to do the right religious things and perform the right religious duties, but we want to have a right attitude. We want to always be in right standing, don't we? Ah, yes. And then I love how it ends. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, but the one who humbles themselves will be exalted. Now I want to give you a closing, I think some fitting words here from Thorwald Lorenzen. And he notes that the parable reminds us that even the most religious person can miss the purpose and goal of life. Isn't that sad? Even the most religious person can miss the purpose and goal of life. He goes on to note, the text therefore invites the religious, that's us in here, right? The religious, to rediscover a sincere and a humble relationship with God and a proper relationship with others. And then he closes with this. This parable also invites the irreligious, the ungodly, to approach God in humility, appealing to His mercy, and having confidence in His willingness to justify them, to bring them into right standing despite their sinfulness. So this parable speaks to two groups of people, the righteous and the unrighteous.